Oh, okay, we're live. Okay, Gewaltig. So let's get started. So we are right at the top of Daf Chaf Hey Amud Beis. Koya Marashem. Omar Rabba. Rabba said, Omar Rabba Bar Rafuna. Omar Rav. Hasoicher Amas Hamayim Me'er Yotiv. Someone had a little pond in his yard, and what he did was he plugged it up, which means no water can come in and no water could go out, and all the fish inside would now be secured. Rashi says, Soisma, he plugs it, that on Yom Tov no fish will get captured. Vesela, and all those that are there before Yom Tov, Heichen are prepared, the Hizmin, al Yidei Maisa, through the Maisa with which he plugged the dam going in and out of his pond. Mutaran, and therefore the fish are mutar. Amar Reb Chisda. Reb Chisda was a Talmud of Rav, and we're soon going to see he had a whole chever. Reb Nachman was part of the chever, and Rabbi Bar Rafuna was part of the chever. And what Reb Chisda said is, Midiver Rebbeinu, from the halacha that Rav said that if you plug a pond, all the fish are muchad and mezumin, you're allowed to use them on Yom Tov. Nilmoid, we can also learn that chaya shekanin of pardes, agetavach edi. Nice to see you. A chaya that set up its nest. Then I'm not sure when a deer sets herself up to give birth. I'm not sure if it's called nesting or if it's called creating a den. Maybe it's called creating a living room, but it sets itself up to give birth. The pardes in your orchard, any tree chazima, that doesn't require anything at all. So somehow Reb Chisda made a link from someone plugging up a pond, which makes the fish mezumin, to a deer on its own setting up in your pardes without any action of yourself, that doesn't need zimun, and you'd be allowed to use the baby that's born. Let's see Rashi, the pardes. Mokam hamishtamer, it would be a protected area. Ve'ein avlad yoytei, once the baby is born, it won't be able to run away. Sheni yochel avroich, a newborn deer can't really run quickly or far. The kalat soite, and therefore it would be very easy to capture this deer. And therefore, einei tzarech simun, doesn't need any special preparation. The hahacha mepnei sheistuma vein yochel lotzeis kari lehu muchana. By the fish, once the pond is sealed, we consider it mucha. So therefore, the animals in this orchard should also be considered mucha. Now, of course, there's a glaring problem with this comparison, because there I physically stopped, plugged the water in and out, while in the pardes I did nothing at all. And that's what Rashi points out. How could you compare plugging a pond to doing nothing? So how could Reb Chisda make that stretch from what he heard from Rav and say that animals in a orchard that's set up on their own should be considered mucha? So we'll see that.
Shechting the newborn deer on Yom Tov.
That's what we're discussing. That's right.
And since when are you allowed to shech the newborn calf?
Why can't you shech? You can shech them.
No, because I thought there's an issue of that if it was not going to live, you don't know if it wasn't going to live yet because it's only a day old.
No, I think you're allowed. I don't think so.
You're allowed to?
I believe so. I believe so.
So
but
since
nevertheless, even if the animal gave birth a week ago, and the animal was in that setting, it's also considered muchad. It not necessarily happened. It didn't give birth on Yom Tov. If it gave birth on Yom Tov, then you would not be able to shech the baby, because then it would be a noilat, literally. So the baby had to have been born before Yom Tov. It could have been born even a couple of days before Yom Tov. But as long as the mother's there with her baby, that baby is considered muchad.
Muchad means that you were planning to shecht it on Yom Tov.
That's right. So you don't have to make a maisa. We consider it automatically that it's in your pardes. You would consider it muchad, which is a big stretch.
And with the fish, you didn't have to know which fish you were planning to catch and eat.
No,
because like with the pigeons, you had to pick which one you were going to use, right?
You had to pick a specific one. But here you could take any fish, it seems.
So that's when you catch a fish, and even though you're going to throw it back because it's too small, you're still allowed to catch the fish.
That's a good point. That's a good one. I don't know. You're raising a good point. Why should the fish be any different than the chicken? What if it's a small fish? I'm not going to want it, so I'm picking it up. It should be muksa. But for some reason, we consider all the fish in the pond mukha. I don't know. Maybe they just took whatever they got. But pashtus, the distinction that you're making that exists by birds should apply by fish. If in fact that's what people do, they'll take it throw back. I don't see why they should.
It's not possible to prepare in advance for fish. You don't see it. How can you going to prepare? I want that fish in the sea. It's not possible. They're all hidden.
In a bird, each one has its own area, so it's possible. Yeah, but what David's saying is whether it's possible or not. If it's not mazuman, it's muksa. So I guess you could be masmin the whole group of fish. I think it's a good.
Maybe we have to ask the bird rabbi what to do.
Okay, so let's see what the Gemara says. So first, Reb Chisda said it, and Reb Nachman said, Reb Chisda, you're getting yourself into big trouble. What you did is the equivalent of getting up in the Gura and saying nobody should wear masks. They're crazy. Amar Reb Nachman, Nofel Chavrin B'Rav Revosa. Our buddy Reb Chisda just said something so controversial that he's going to get attacked from all sides. He just got himself into big trouble. Ikadamri, there's another version that it wasn't Reb Chisda who made this statement. It was Rabbi Barafuna. Amar Rabbi Barafuna, the same thing as before. And Reb Nachman said, "Oh, did you say something that's going to get you into trouble?" Amar Reb Nachman, Nafal Bar Chavrin B'Rav Revosa. Our friend has got himself into big trouble. And now the Gemara is saying why he's in big trouble. Why will everyone say and attack him for what he said? If animals give birth in your orchard, you haven't done anything to show any type of zimun. But hacha, when you're plugging up a stream, kavod ma'isa, he's actually doing a ma'isa. So that's why we don't like Reb Chisda's comment or Rabbi Barafuna's comment, because just because Rav said that when you plug up a pond, that's called zimun, who said that you don't need zimun for these animals? Frek the Gemara. Now the Gemara is going a step further. Until now we said you can't prove from Rav that you wouldn't need zimun. Now the Gemara is going to ask, I'm actually going to prove that you're wrong, Reb Chisda. I'm going to prove that you're wrong, Rabbi Barafun. And I'm going to show you from a Beitzah, in fact, that specifically you do have to make zimun on a chaya, on a baby chaya that was born in your orchard. Because Vatani we learned in a Beitzah, chaya shekadna b'parkus, this precise case, tricha zimun. So it says black and white, not like Reb Chisda, not like Rabbi Barafuna. Now there's a lot more in the Beitzah. The tzipor dror, a tzipor dror is a bird. Rashi says that's when it's born, it's very small, and the mother is small, and because of that, it's hard to make a distinction between the mother and the child, and therefore, tzarich likshar biknafeha, you'd have to make some type of siman, tie something on its wing, kidei shelo tischalaf be'ima, so that you'll know that it's the child that you were mezamin and not the mother. V'zu edus shehi'idu mipishmai v'aftali, and this isn't some fly-by-night halacha. This was said over from Shmai and Naftali. So this is fact that a chaya does need zimun, and therefore it's a direct contradiction to Reb Chisda and Rabbi Barafuna, to Yofta. So they're Augushlagen. And in fact, if chaya gives birth to a little baby chaya, like a little baby deer, in your orchard, you can't just use it on Yom Tov, unless before Yom Tov you go and designate it and say, I'm going to use this. Frank the Gemara, is that so? Maybe I can bring your raya to the other extreme. Well, me boy zimun doesn't need zimun. I'm going to bring you a Beitzah that says that you don't need zimun. So we're then going to have a contradiction in Beitzahs. But Tanya, Amar B'Shim ben Elazar, Moedim B'Shamai B'Sil, B'Shamai and B'Sil both agree. Al shehes minan b'soichakei. If you prepared birds inside a nest, and you found them in front of the nest, shasurim that are awesome. Now we should learn Rashi on this because this case is just a couple of blood ago. We learned in Beitzah. So let's learn Rashi to chazer over that case. Zokt Rashi, like we discussed on Daf Aleph. So you shnei kinin, there were two kavis, let's say kavi number 1 and kavi number 2. He identified that the birds in kavi number 1, he was going to use tomorrow to eat on Yom Tov, and not the birds in Kabi number 2. He found right near Kabi number 1 the birds, but they're no longer in Kabi number 1 where he designated them. They're now outside the Kabi on a ledge. And then Kabi number 2, that was completely empty. So now the question is, did these birds come from the Kabi or did they come from outside the Kabi? And everybody agrees, the Mishnah said, Shasurin, those birds are usher. We don't assume that these birds came out of this Kabi that I was mizamin. Maybe these birds came from elsewhere. And therefore, it's going to be usher. So that's one place we need it. Now, when do you say that you need a special asmana on birds? We learned this yesterday. Either doves of a coop or an attic. These are all places where doves come from the wild and they park there. And the idea is you set these things up so that you can capture these birds, or birds that set up their nests in these horizontal pipes that are placed in the walls specifically to create habitat for birds to come and settle there. So all these birds need a smana, like we learned yesterday, because they're going to run away when you try to get them. You don't feed them, they get their own food. And when you try to get them, even if they're in their nests, they'll escape. But geese and chickens, the yoini herdesias, and doves of herdesias, of that type, which is what's relevant to our sugya, mutar and vein shvichen zimun. So now you have a brisa that says black and white, like Reb Chisda. In fact, that a chaya that gave birth in an orchard, that little baby, is considered mezumin, and you don't need to do anything. Now let's just get, so that's what's relevant to us. That's our stira. But let's just go back to Avazim and Tarnagoyim that are considered mezumin. We learned yesterday that the reason why they're considered mezumin is A, you have to feed them, and B is if you run after them, they'll run to their nests, but they'll run to their nests where you can still capture them. So that's why they're considered mezumin already. But the other types of birds mentioned earlier are not considered mezumin. But again, the issue at hand is we have a brisa that says black and white that chaya shekana b'pardis does not need zimun. And the tzibur drawer tzorich lekasher b'knafel kidei shelo yitzchalach be'imo, which we just learned. And then v'hamakusharim, if you have birds that have this symbol on their wing, like they have to be tied up, v'aminu ananim, or birds that you specifically touched to identify that you're going to be using them on Yom Tov. If they're beboyers, ubabatim, ubasichen, umaores, if they're in any type of place where they're sort of restricted, restrained, that means they're set aside for you. Mutarin, there you can go on Yom Tov to these areas and take the birds to eat. But if you place these birds on a tree, asur, you're not allowed to take them on Yom Tov. For a completely side reason, not relevant to our sugya, is shema yalavi yitlash. We don't allow you to take things off of trees because we're afraid if you do, you might actually climb up and break off a branch. Now, what if you stomachly found on the street on a Tuesday afternoon, you find a bird that's mekusher, it has something tied around between, or menu on them. You could tell, I don't know how you can tell that someone handled it because he wanted to set it aside for use. There you can't take those birds because clearly somebody already picked those birds, was cutting them, and designated them for their use, and therefore it would be asur mishum geser. How are they cutting it? Rashi says with Hagbah, and Tosfos says it's even by looking at Hefker, it's kainah. So the Gemara here we have a stira. The first price said
Yosy, didn't they made a simon on the birds? So if they made a simon, that was their kinyan.
Making a simon is not a kinyan. There are specific things that allow you to be kainah. If you make a simon on a bird that's not yours, it doesn't make you be kainah.
Weren't these wild birds?
Even if there were wild birds, making a simon on them is not what would make you be kainah them. You have to either make a kinyan hadbah or any other official valid kinyan.
Okay, well, you figure they made a kinyan if they live to make this, if they're bothering to make a simon, but
yes, that's making a shinui. Could you be kained through a shinui of the type of simon? That's what I think David is asking.
That's not a valid kinyan. It's not the only
shinui is a kinyan. Shinui is a kinyan. you're going to clip its wing.
Shinui is not a kinyan. Shinui. All shinui does, if you steal something from somebody and you made a shinui, it removes your chiyuv to return it, possibly. But it's not a kinyan. It's not a kinyan when you want to acquire something. If I want to buy something from you, making a shinui will not make me own it. Will not transfer the ownership. It will not transfer the ownership. Okay, so let's see what we have over here. So we have a stira now because we have one brisa that says animals that set up in your orchard are muzumin, and we have another brisa that says they're not muzumin. So I'm not going to loikash haba ima. The child itself, that's considered muzumin, and the brisa that says it's muzumin is referring to if you want to eat the child. Haba ima. The brisa that says that you need zimun is referring to if you want to eat the mother, you need to make zimun on the mother, designate that the mother is the animal that you're going to eat. Frekti Gemara, you cannot say that because ima bezimun sagila. Are you going to suggest just by saying I plan to eat that deer, that adult deer, that's going to make it mutter? Tzeidim al Yusufah. You have to capture it first. You're not allowed to make tzeidah on Yom Tov. So in order to be able to eat the mother, the brisa just says you need zimun. If the mother was not captured, zimun is hardly enough. You actually have to go and restrain it and tie it down. Both the brises that says you need zimun and that says you don't need zimun are both speaking about the baby. However, if the baby is in an orchard that's right near the city, close by, there we say you don't need zimun. We say automatically your intent is to eat those animals. But if it's on a property that's far away from your house, out of the city, that's not something that we say you're automatically mechaven to use for Yom Tov, and therefore you need zimun. Okay, beautiful. Now we have a fascinating Gemara. Zok Gemara. Behema misukenes. Imagine you have an animal that's about to die, but it's not a treifa. And it's possible to have an animal that's about to die, but it's not a treifa. And you're on Yom Tov, and you've already eaten your suda, so there's no need to shecht an animal because you don't need it. But the problem is, if you shecht this animal, you get valuable meat out of it. If you wait till it dies and it becomes an avela, then it lost most of its value. So you want to salvage the value that you have in this animal, but you don't need it for a meal. So the law is lo yishchat. You're not allowed to shecht it Yom Tov in the afternoon. Ella imkain yeshos b'yoyim lechel mimenu kazayis tzli. Unless you have time to be able to roast a kazayis of basar. So what does it take to put on the grill? 20 minutes, whatever it is, you need that time. If you have enough time, then it's cooked. Now we know there's a rule of hoil. Normally you're allowed to cook on Yom Tov for Shabbos because hoil dumli kloy orf. Here, you're late in the day. Hoil won't work anymore. You're not going to have guests. But if I specifically shecht it with the specific kavanah to eat it, that's different. Then I don't need hoil. I'm actually going to eat it. If I'm actually going to eat a kazayis tzli, then I'm allowed to shecht it today because I'm going to eat it on Yom Tov. You don't need that much time to cut it up and take a piece of meat and put it on the fire. You could even cut a piece of meat that's raw right out of the neck because that's where it's cut open. And if just a couple of seconds, just a scoop out of kazayis of raw meat and eat it, that would be enough. Shachta besada. What if you shechted this animal under one of these shitas where you were allowed to, but you shechted it in the field? So the question is, if you on Yom Tov bring in a full animal like you see up north, people have on the front of their trucks that they caught a deer, they have a big deer mounted to their hood. If they see you carrying a full deer, it's a bizayin for Yom Tov. It's a zilzal for Yom Tov. So therefore, lo yivienu b'moitu v'moitu. Although maybe b'yadei var mevorim, you could butcher the animal out of the field, and you could bring it in little by little, so that it doesn't make a big roishim on people that they see that you shechted an animal Yom Tov in the afternoon at a time where you wouldn't have really needed to eat.
Unless you're davened v'sikin. Go through the concept of hoyel again. I'm not clear as to the line between a hoyel and what you're doing here.
Hoyel means even if I don't intend to eat this animal on Yom Tov, Since there's a possibility that it will be used if I have guests, that's enough to allow you to do this on Yom Tov.
And when does the Hoyel Zman start? When we're doing an Erev Tavshilin, is a Hoyel even an hour before? That's when we're preparing for Shabbos on Yom Tov.
I don't know if that's correct. In an Erev Tavshilin, you actually have to make sure that whatever you cook for Shabbos will be ready early enough before Shabbos that you can actually eat it. If it's not, if your chont that you put up with your Erev Tavshilin is not edible before Shabbos, then you have a problem.
Well, that's the same on any Shabbos. Really, the chont has to be cooked before Shabbos too, to a large degree, right? That's no different. But I'm saying the Hoyel kicks in at
but
a
now it has to be ready
minimum time.
at least 15 minutes even before that time, because you have to be able to serve it to guests before Shabbos.
So, and here, even
Here,
even if
we're talking about a scenario where you didn't have that Hoyel. If you have that Hoyel, then you're okay. But what if you didn't have that Hoyel?
So you're talking about it's already dark and you're outside and it's really late and you want to shech this animal.
Or no, let's take a step back. Or it's not Erev Shabbos. So Hoyel works to allow you to cook for Shabbos. But if tonight's Hoyel, then you can't cook in the afternoon for Shabbos with intent of eating it tomorrow. You're not allowed to cook after you finish your meal on Yom Tov, and it's not Shabbos the next day. It's usher to cook for Chol. So there would be no way that you would be able to shech this animal. If it was Erev Shabbos and you were preparing it for Shabbos, that would be a different story. But that's not the situation over here. Tonight's Motzei Yom Tov. So the question is, are you allowed to shech this animal this afternoon? Because you're not going to be using it for the meal today. Hoyel never allows you to cook lechatchila. Hoyel just makes it that with the Eved you're not chayiv alav, you're not over alav. But once it's only the Rabbana, it's not a deraisa anymore because of Hoyel. So then to allow you to cook lechatchila, they allow you to cook lechatchila with an erev tavshilin.
Yeah, but if on Yom the same scenario, they're not shechting. Tomorrow's not Shabbos. Today's Yom Tov, and I want to cook something 10 minutes before the end of Shabbos. There's no problem with
before the end of Yom Tov.
Before the end of Yom Tov.
Only if you're going to be able to eat it on Yom Tov.
Correct.
It would have to be ready early enough that you'd be able to eat it on Yom Tov, and you have to cook it with the intent to eat it on Yom Tov.
Correct. So I can cook a whole roast.
You have to actually eat it before you have to actually eat it before Yom Tov, at least some of it.
So I can cook an entire roast, half an hour by Neila Sachag. I can cook a roast.
As long as you could eat a kazayas of it.
Right. So that's the same as where we're shechting here, right? Correct. So long I can eat kazayas, I can shech the entire
animal. Correct.
Okay.
So Amar Rami Bar Abba. Rami Bar Abba said an interesting halacha. He said, Havshit v'yituach boil. There's a rule by every carbon. You have to skin it. When you're serving it to the Rebbeinu Shalom, you have to skin it, and then you have to cut it up into pieces. So Rami Bar Abba, I want you to know, you also have to do that same before you're allowed to eat meat. If you're a butcher and you want to be able to eat meat, you're not allowed to eat it before you take the skin off and you cut it into pieces. Why is that? What will be the reason for that? The reason for that is because if the animal is treifa, there's no way you'll know before you take the skin off and cut it into pieces and check. And you can't check while it's in one piece while it has its skin on. So Rabbi Bar Abba is saying that you're not allowed to eat meat unless it's skinned and cut into pieces. Zok the Gemara, mikan lom the Torah derech. The Torah is teaching you derech. Shelo yochel adam basar koydem hefshit v'nituach. You're not allowed to eat meat until you skin the animal and you cut it into pieces. And Rashi explains that does Rami Bar Chama mean to say that me'ikar adin, it's usher to eat any animal before you cut it open and check for treifas, because we assume by default that every animal is treifa and you're not allowed to eat it before you check? Or maybe we hold by default every animal is not a treifa, but he's just saying it's a good idea, it's derech eretz to check, because just in case you don't check and you end up finding that it was a treifa, even though you were allowed to eat it because you could assume it was kosher, but if you end up finding out that it's a treifa, it's just take a level. So you're better off checking first. So is Rami Barabbas mandating you must check? If not, you're over at the Raisa because you're eating something that's huchsuk to be a treifa, or is it just a suggestion? If it's a mandate that be the Raisa, you're mechuyev to check because otherwise you assume it's becheskes treifa, which would not be consistent with Rafuna. The Amar Rafuna, behema bechayeh, an animal that's alive. The cheskes iser emelis. It has a cheskes iser. Rashi says, what is the cheskes iser? Ever min achai. Achi yivadalach b'manishchita. Until you know for sure it was a kosher shchita, you assume it's us. So let's say it was shechted, and you're not sure if the shchita was kosher or not. We say the animal's us because it was in the cheskes of an iser ever min achai, and that the cheskes iser ever min achai will not be discharged until we have proof positive that it was shechted properly. But once it was shechted properly, nishchata, once it was shechted, yes.
How's that a chazaka if it's no more possible even to be Abram Nechai?
Because it's dead.
Right.
Gewaltige kasha. That's a gewaltige kasha. How could you have a cheskes Abram Nechai if it's dead? Right? So that is Tosfos' kasha. How could you, Rashi, tell me that it has a cheskes isser, a cheskes Abram Nechai? It's very dead now. It's not Abram Nechai. It might be a nevela, but it's not an Abram Nechai. And there is no cheskes nevela here. There was a cheskes Abram Nechai before. That's Tosfos' kasha. So because of that kasha, Tosfos makes up a new chazak. He says, he brings from a pasuk, it says, Tizbach v'yachalta, and we learn from there that shchoit v'achal, you cannot eat meat unless you shecht it. So there's an isser, it's an isser asay, of eina zavuach. Anything that's not properly shechted, there's an isser. That isser applies when the animal's alive, and that isser applies when the animal's dead. So Tosfos says the chazaka that we're talking about is the isser of eina zavuach. But Rashi learns that you do have the chazaka of Abram Nechai. How does that work? So Rashi holds there's a concept of machsakinon me isser le isser. When something's usser because of one reason, it will remain with the cheskes isser, even though we're transferring over to a new isser, an isser of nevela. So you could say that the chazaka of Abram Nechai will now transfer into a chazaka of nevela, because you could connect one isser to the next isser. And this is a big machlokes we're showing in Rashi and Tosfos. If you say machsakinon me isser le isser or not. And the lumdus behind it could possibly be, is chazaka a bearer? Does chazaka clarify what occurred? Or is chazaka just telling us how to paskin in this situation? If you hold chazaka as a bearer, then there's no logic whatsoever to say machsakinim isser l'isser, because bearer means the status quo remained. There's no way that could justify saying that the status quo changed from Abram Nechai to nevela. But if chazaka is merely a psak halacha, it tells you that when something's osir, we assume that it remains osir until we have proof that it became mutter. So then I would understand why you could say machsakinon me isser l'isser. But that's a beautiful kasha, and that's why Tosfos learns that it's a new chazaka of ein zavuach. Nishchata, but once we've broken that cheskes isser, and we know we have a kosher shchita, we for sure assume that this animal is not a treifa. The cheskes heter emedes. By default, treifa is not common, and we assume that it's mutter. Until you know with what it became treifa. And Rashi adds to it, what if you cut open the animal and you find a nail that punctured its stomach? But you cannot tell, did that nail puncture the stomach while the animal was still alive, which would have made this animal into a treifa, or maybe the nail was in the animal's stomach when you shechted it, and only after you shechted it, the nail punctured the stomach, and then it's kosher. Zok Rav Huna, that case will be kosher. You know why? Because once the shechita was done by kashrus, we assumed the animal was not a treifa, and if you have a suffix treifa, we paskin lufu. That's Rav Huna's shita, and we actually paskin like Rav Huna. We don't check for all treifas. The only treifas we check for, I think, are the lungs, and we check and where that comes from. To check for the lungs, it's actually a shalom achronim when that takana was made, because lungs are very susceptible to damage, and it's not all animals, not all ages, but it's a special chumrah. But it's definitely not a cheskes isser. The chazaka is that animals are not treif. So, Frank the Gemara, if that's what Rami Ba'aba means, that he argues with Rav Huna and he holds that we have to assume animals are treif until we can verify that they're not treif, well then v'hanant mas nisin kid Rav Huna. Our Mishnah is proof to Rav Huna. Titnan Rabbi Kiva Omer afilu kazayis chaymi beis tvichasa. Rabbi Kiva said that even if you scoop up meat from the neck of the animal where the cut was, that's good enough to allow you to shech the meat. Well, according to Rami Bar Abba, if he's saying it's osher to eat meat until it's cut into pieces, how could our Mishnah make sense? So you have proof from our Mishnah to Rav Huna that once it's shechted, we assume that it's not a treif. My love, mi based tfichas mamish. What does the Mishnah mean? From its neck, which means you haven't even cut the animal into pieces. So after my law, you don't have a raya. It's mimokam shetevachas achilos. Maybe it means from the stomach, which means you are going to cut the animal open. And the stomach is the organ shetevachas achilosa that shechs the food that the cow eats. In other words, it dissolves, it processes, it digests the food that the cow eats. And that's what, it's possible, that's what Rabbi Kiva meant, mi beis tevichasa. So therefore, you don't have a raya from our Mishnah that you're allowed to eat an animal. Before you check it, maybe you can, and therefore it's not a raya. But Reb Chia made it very clear that it doesn't mean the neck. So Zok Gemara, okay, if that's the case, you're right. Which means everybody must agree that me'ikar adin, you can assume an animal is not a treif, and therefore you're allowed to even take meat from the neck even before you cut the animal open to check it. Ela Rami Bar Chama. So Rami Bar Abba, who says that you have to cut your meat open into pieces and check it before you eat it, that must not be the Raisa mandate saying that it has a din of a treifa until you check. Rather, it's just oirech hara, and oirech hara means well, you shouldn't miss a treifa. It's not a treifa. It's just derech eretz. And Tosha says the vadei leke iser. There's no iser. The mishanishchada hiyamedes b'cheskaseter. Once we shecht it, we assume it's not a treifa. Miyuzok Tosfos. Im nimtzas treifa la'achashacha. What's going to happen is you ate it, you were allowed to eat it, you didn't have to check. But what happens? You cut it open later and you find it was a treifa. You feel pretty stupid. So hu nenash kishoygig v'loikoinus. He's going to get punished like a shoygig, not like an oinus. We don't look at him like an oinus. You know why? So what Abba, who was it again? It was Rami Bar Abba. Rami Bar Abba said, yes, you're allowed to eat it to make din, and you're not over an avera. It's not hopsuk to be treifa, it's hopsuk to be not a treifa. But if you rush to eat it and you don't check and it turns up being treifa, it's like a shogi. It's a shtickle avera, and therefore he said you should always butcher it before. Now there's a very interesting point to ask. If you want to eat raw meat, do you have to kasher raw meat? Now we know you don't have to kasher meat that you're roasting, but if you want to take a piece of raw meat, do you have to kasher it? Do you have to salt it and take the blood out or not? So from our Mishnah, you have a raya that you do not have to kasher raw meat. If you want to eat raw meat, you don't have to salt it to take out the blood. How do we know? Because when you salt meat, the amount of time that you have to leave the meat in the salt, the halacha is the amount of time it would take to roast the animal. So let's think. The first sheet of the Mishnah said you have to have enough time to roast the animal. Rabbi Kiva is obviously trying to say you don't need that much time. You need less time. And that's why he said, Afiluk says, if you would have to salt that meat, then it's just as much time as the tzli. So you haven't gained anything. So obviously from Rabbi Kiva, you see that if you're eating the meat raw, you don't have to salt it. You can just chop the meat up and eat it with the blood.
Not so clear, Yosy.
I'm not coming through clear?
No, what you're saying about being allowed to eat meat that you don't have to salt it, because over here it specifies only from the place where you cut it, which the blood drains out from naturally because there's a cut there. And maybe that's why you're allowed to eat from that spot only, and it specifies that spot. So
you want to say that maybe based fichasa is because of the dam. The Gemara is assuming the based fichasa is the chiddush, is that's where there's the fastest place where you can get a piece of meat from is the based fichasa because it's already open meat. You want to time them maybe dafka the based fichasa because the blood is purged there.
I'm not saying dafka, I'm saying, but it happens to be an additional bonus. You know what I'm saying? Of course, it's accessible, but it also happens to that the blood is gone.
But the main purging of the blood by the shchita, I assume, is from the arteries, not from the actual flesh of the animal.
Well, that's the main. That's the lifeblood that comes out by the shechita. But if the meat is
that's not only,
exposed,
but dame vorim. The Gemara wants a dame vorim, which is the blood that's absorbed in the meat. You're allowed to eat that without salting. It's only usher if you cook it, because then the blood will leave the meat and it'll go back into the meat. But dame vorim that's in the meat as you eat it would not be a problem. Okay, I hear what you say. That maybe that would be better. It's a good svara, but the Gemara doesn't mention it. But I hear what you're saying. Okay, so let's see what the Gemara says.
Yosy, what would be the rationale to all of a sudden be allowed to eat blood?
Because the halach is dam evarim is only usher if it left and it went back in. Dam evarim that was in the aver that never left the aver is not usher to eat. The isur dam is only if it left and it went back in. So if you cook it, it's going to leave the meat and it's going to go to the water of the pot, and then through the cooking, it's going to get back absorbed into the pot. But when the blood is remaining in the meat, there's no isur dam on that.
Allah Lamaisa, we're allowed to barbecue steak that wasn't kosher.
Of course.
But you said that, I think you spoke about that a while ago. Right?
You are. As a matter of fact, that's how they kosher liver. They barbecue it without salting. If
Right.
you barbecue, you do not have to salt. But when you're going to buy meat from the butcher, they're not going to release it until it's good for all uses. But technically, you can barbecue meat without salting it. I remember when we were learning Beitzah b'cholov, when we were learning Hilchos Treifus in Lakewood. So one field trip we had is we bought a little sheep in a farm, and we hung it off someone's swing set in their backyard, and the sheikh had shechted it, and we went through all the badikas, and then we had barbecue right there. We didn't salt it at all.
It sounds like one of the Tomchei Shabbos parties. So what's the blood that's usher? What's the blood then that's usher?
Only if you cook the meat or bake the meat. But if it's roasting, the meat, the blood will come right out of it.
So if we took the whole, Korban Pesach, technically,
they didn't salt it.
Cooking the whole animal. They didn't salt it. They shechted it and put the spit in.
Correct.
Because it was barbecued.
Because it was barbecue.
I mean, the whole shiloh would be the part that's touching the metal spit, which is cooking, so the blood can come in and go there. That might be an area. They might need to cut some of that area off. The actual part that's touching the metal. But the part that's facing the flame does not need to be salted.
Is there a restaurant in New York that I can get this? We serve our meat bloody.
Well, at any butcher, you could buy roasted meat that wasn't salted, and that's what the liver is. Liver is meat that was roasted, wasn't salted.
Nobody's making liver on a barbecue. They're making rib steak on a barbecue. That's what Kiva wants.
I hear you. I mean, listen, in America, for the right price, you can get anything. Okay, so let's see the Gemara Vayter. So the Gemara says that Rami Bar Chama, so Rami Bar Abba, keep it mixed up. It's Rami Bar Abba. Rami Bar Abba, in fact, was not saying that there's an Isser you mechuyev to, but he's saying it's derech eretz too, because why get yourself into a situation where you can get stuck? Kedetanya, like we learned in the Beitzah, there's several different items that you should be careful with so that you shouldn't get into trouble. Number one, a person shouldn't eat a garlic or an onion from its edge, from its top, olive only from its leaf side. And I'm not sure what's the lack of derech eretz about how you're eating the leaf, about how you're eating the head. I think what the Mefarshim say is if you eat it from the leaf side, then you're going to cut the leaf off first. You're going to open it up, and you're going to eat it like a mensch. But if you just take the whole cluster of garlic in your hand, and you hold it by the leaf, and you bite it from the other side, it's mechsi karafsin. Rashi, it's near karafsin. It looks like you're a little bit of a chazir. And if you ate that way, hareza rafsin, it's a little bit chazerish. There is another similar thing. A person shouldn't gulp his whole kos in one gulp, unless it's a koshel mitzvah, we learned. If you gulp down the kos in one gulp, hareza gargarin, it's also a fresh. Tani Rabban, we learned, Hashoysa koisei bevasachas, hareza gargarin. Shnaim, if you drink it in 2 sips, derech eretz. Shloisha, if you drink it in 3 sips, then you're a show off already. Then you're migasei haruach. The Meshech Chochmah tells us something fascinating. The Torah, when it talks about Yaakov coming to get the brachos from his father Yitzchak, it says that he gave his father, Yaakov gave his father Yitzchak wine. And when it says that he gave him wine, the Torah says, I'll get the actual pasuk inside. It's a fascinating Meshech Chochmah, very short one. So Parshas told us all the way to end, where it's talking about the brachos. The pasuk says as follows. It says, let's see where it is. Oh, here it is. It says, "Vayomer Hagishali." Yitzchak said, "Come to me, va'oichel mitzed b'ni, v'man tavarecha nafshi. Vayagish loy vayoichel vayove." There's a mercha kfula. Vayove loy yayin vayesh. So what's the double loy? So Zok Meshech Chochmah. What this means is that when Yaakov brought Yitzchak to drink the wine, he gave him a sip. He took the kos back, and then he gave it to him again. Why? Because Yitzchak only was going to drink the kos in 2 sips, not in 1 sip, which is consistent with our Gemara here. Okay, so let's see the Gemara Vayter. V'Amar Rami bar Abba, Chatzuva, the Chatzuva plant, which Rashi tells us its roots grow straight down. So it's a perfect plant to use to plant along the border. As a matter of fact, Rashi says that Yeshua used it to plant around the borders. It says, Uva Techam Yeshua liyisrael esaretz. That's how Yeshua made borders, is he planted this vegetable that its root grew straight down. So it acted as a perfect demarcation. Mikta Ragleo in the Rishia. It's going to end up cutting the feet off of the Rishayim, meaning it's going to really mess them up, because it's going to say Makta Ragleo Rishayim. I'm reading Rashi. L'yomadin shegoizlin v'choimsin. They steal and they grab land. They should learn from this vegetable. This vegetable creates integrity of properties. That's how they should act. Give integrity to people's properties, yet they don't. Nitia, a regular fruit that grows on a tree, which we know is also for the first 3 years. So when you plant a tree and you're so excited to eat its fruits, you have to control your taiva, and for 3 years you have to abstain from eating until finally in the 4th year you get to eat. So this concept of abstention and not jumping right into the taiva as soon as it makes itself available, mikter reglein, it's going to cut off the legs. In other words, it's going to be a kitrik for them. The ketzvaya of butchers who eat meat before they cut it up and they check for trephus, which is what our sugi is talking about. And the boilinidas, people who can't wait for their wives to come home from the mikveh and they boil their wives before they come home from the mikveh. They're going to get a lesson from Orla. You see that you're not supposed to grab as soon as you can. Practice a little bit of restraint first. Termusa. Termusa is a round bean that's a very tough bean. It's very bitter to eat. And you have to cook it 7 different times. And after they cook it 7 different times, it finally becomes sweet and enjoyable. And people will eat it after the meal. So this termusa, which after processing it 7 times, it finally becomes edible. Mikter ragleon is an ein shel Yisrael. This is going to chop off the feet of our enemies. Lashon saginor, Rachman al-Islam. Shenemar v'yosifu b'nei Yisrael laso seira b'nei Hashem. This, it says this in Shoftim. Klal Yisrael, once again, every time they finished with a shofet, they slipped and they went back again to do that was bad in their Hajr Bajra. But Yavdu, let's count. Esa Ba'olim, they served the Ba'olim, Avodah Zarah, number 1. Vesa Ashtarois, number 2. Ves Elahei Aram, the Getchkes of Aram, number 3. Ves Elahei Tzidon, number 4. Ves Elahei Moav, number 5. Ves Elahei B'nei Ammon is number 6. Ves Elahei Plishtim is number 7. So just like this bean that has to be cooked 7 times till it gets sweet, these Yidden did get cooked 7 times, and it didn't help. Still, Vayazu es Hashem, they still abandoned the Rebbeinu Shalom, V'lo Yavdu, and they didn't serve as Hashem. If the pasuk says that Klal Yisrael abandoned the Rebbeinu Shalom, They obviously didn't serve their Rebbeinu Shalom if they abandoned him. Uma Talmud Loimer v'lo yavdu. So what does the pasuk mean to tell us extra when the pasuk tells us v'lo yavdu? Amar Rabbi Lozer, this is what it means. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu. Kadosh Baruch Hu says about Klal Yisrael in frustration kavayach. Afilu ketorma sazeh sheshokanoi shesheva pam v'oichel noisei b'knei chsuda lo yasunu vana. Then they're treating me worse than this bean. The bean, after you cook it and process it 7 times, at least at the end you embrace it. Me, I'm not even good like a bean to them because they abandoned me and beat me 7 times and they're still not coming back to me. So the bean is going to cause us a little bit of a kitchen. Why did Klal Yisrael get the Torah? Because we're tough as nails. And the Torah has to temper our toughness. We're going to lay this, we're laying it today, we're going to lay it on Thursday, and we're going to lay it on Simchas Torah. No, we're not going to lay it on Thursday, it's already gracious. We're going to lay it on Simchas Torah. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, Ru'in halolu shetinosen lahem dasesh. Klal Yisrael, who's so tough, it's good to give them a Torah made out of fire because of how tough we are. It'll temper us. Ikadamri, Doseim Shalelu, the Minhagam Shalelu Rashi says, the way Jews act, Eish is like fire, because we're tough like fire. Shalmala Nitna Torah Yisrael, if we weren't tempered and bridled by the Torah, we would literally take over the world. We would be so tough. And in fact, you see, even that abandoned the Torah get into big international trouble. And this also references what Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says. And this is a fascinating Gemara. Gimel Azen Hey. There are 6 super tough people. Yisrael b'umos, Klal Yisrael compared to the rest of the nations. Kelev, a dog, b'chayis compared to the rest of the chayis. Tarnagor, a chicken, b'oifish compared to the rest of the birds. The yesh aimim af eiz, also a goat, b'behemadako. The yesh aimim af tzalaf, the plant called tzalaf, which I think is called a caperberry, be'ilomis, among the trees. So what is so tough about a tzalaf? So Rashi says, just to the left here, Lo yadati mahu azu shalom. I don't know what's so tough about this bush. So Tosha speaks out that this bush produced a lot of different things. Evyonos, kafrisin, and alum. Its leaves are edible, its little fruit are edible, its shells are edible, and they produce fruits every day to the aggressive plant. It grows aggressively, and they also make wine out of it. So there's a lot of product that comes out of this plant. It's very productive, so that's why it's so tough. But the Mesivta brings down from a sefer called Nachlas Yaakov, fascinating part. The Mekoshish Eitzim was Machal Shabbos in the Midbar, and he was killed for it. Does anybody know who that Mekoshish Eitzim was?
I think it's Slavchad. Is there a
Slavchad, exactly. And there's a Gemara in Shabbos that tells us Rabbi Kiva said, it was Rabbi Kiva, and once again it's Akiva here, who divulged to us the secret that the Mekoshish Eitzim was Tzlofchad. The Gemara says there, when that Rabbi Kiva divulged that, his friends told him, oh, you're going to be in trouble. Because if you're right, you're going to be in trouble because Hashem wanted to conceal that fact and didn't publicize it, and you're now publicizing. And if it's not true, so then your mamash moichi shemra on tzalafcha, then you're really in big trouble. Later on, the Gemara in Shabbos says another fascinating story. Maaseh b'chosedech. There was a chosid who noticed on Shabbos that the fence around his property was breached, and he had a thought to fix that fence. And then he said, "Oh, but today's Shabbos, I cannot fix the fence," and he withheld himself from fixing the fence. That's chus, the Gemara tells us. A plant grew up to block that breach in the fence. And what plant was it? It was the tzlaf. It was one tzlaf. It was a tzlaf chad. It was a single tzlaf that blocked the breach in the fence. And the Gemara says that being that this is such a productive tree or plant, this person was able to live off the pears of that tree for a long time, him and his children. In the schus that he restrained himself from violating Shabbos. So the Sifrei Kabbalah say, the Sifrei Mekubalim say, and it's referring to the Ben Ish Chai, it's referring to the Shalach Kodesh, and it's referring to the Chasam Sofer who quotes from a sefer called Sefer Hagil Gulim. I'm not quite familiar with these types of svarim. That says that this guy was a Gilgal, this Chassid Echad was a Gilgal of Tzlafka. And with this act of refraining from building his fence, he was masakin the Chilul Shabbos that he did in the Midbar, and that's Merumas in the Tzlaf Chad, this one tzlaf tree that grew to plug the hole in his fence. So that they say, that's why this plant is an az, because this plant has some nerve to expose and reveal to the world that it was Tzlaf Chad who was the Mekosher Sheitz. That was a fascinating, fun fact that I saw brought down in the notes of the Mesivta Gor.
Yeshkoyach, Yosy, thank you for digging beneath the surface and showing us what's going on behind the curtains, Machorei Pargud. But just to understand this allegory, what is the aggression? I guess that's the term for Az of Kelev B'chayos. I know Tarnagol Boifus is going crazy. He feels like he's in charge. What exactly is the Kelev and Chayos? Which kind of Chayos are these? He's going to go into lion's den. He's going to get eaten alive.
So what I would guess, and just speculation, that whenever you need a chaya to corral animals, to control animals, to have sort of a leadership position, you use a dog. You don't. The shepherds use dogs to corral animals. So it doesn't mean that he's asked towards other chayas. It means that of all the chayas, it's the most bold because it takes charge of different scenarios. That's what I was thinking, but I don't know the answer.
So that's the Azin Yisrael Be'umais? But the Azin Yisrael Be'umais means that they take charge? Is the same way? I just want to see how each of these allegories fit. The Tzlaf Bilonis I understood. You explained it well.
Well, the Gemara says if we were not bridled by the Torah, restrained by the Torah, we would take over the world. So maybe the protocols would have some validity if we didn't have the Torah.
Okay.
So, I mean, we look at the Epsteins and the Weinsteins of the world, and when they abandoned the Torah, look at how they oppress people. And so maybe that's what's referring to, but I don't know. Anyone who could shed some insight on it, I'd appreciate. Okay, let's hear the Gemara about it.
And Rashi says, "Azim kashin le'inatzach." It's hard to beat them.
So let's see Rashi inside.
So in other words, without the Torah, it's the Torah that makes us weaker. If not for the Torah, we would be in charge. The reason why the Umas have any kind of shlita on us is because of the Torah. That's what Reish Lakish said.
It's mateshes koicham u'machnes libam. It
Right.
makes us more vulnerable. Where does Rashi say this, Rabbi Shaul?
Rashi Azim.
Let's see where.
There's the second Azim, actually.
Azim, koshim lehinatzeach. They're very hard to
beat.
Become victorious over. Oh, and look what it says in English.
Indirish.
English. You can't win with a Hungarian. English means akshonim. They're stubborn. They're focused on their goal like a laser, and you can't divert their attention from acquiring what they're looking for. It's English. It makes perfect sense. Okay, gewaltig. Okay, shkoyach. So let's see the Gemara weiter. Shachta besada. If you shecht it in the field, lo yuve'enu b'moy. Don't bring it in with, that'll create in a situation that'll give it publicity. Toner Rabbanan. In a suma yotze b'maklei, a blind person is not allowed to go out with his stick on Yom Tov, and Rashi says that derech choil, it looks vachendik because elusa the Yom Tov. and it's a little bit of a slight to Yom Tov, to the covenant of Yom Tov. A shepherd with his work sack, and you're not allowed to go out with a chair. Meaning, in those days, they would have an honorable person sit on the chair, and they would carry him on the chair. Nowadays, we have wheelchairs that have wheels, but in the days of the Flintstones, even the wheelchairs were propelled by people's feet. So these chairs were chairs that people would sit on, and people would carry him on the chair. That's not appropriate for Yom Tov. Whether it's a man or a woman. Is that so that you're not allowed to carry somebody on the chair? Rabbi Yaakov Idi sent to us that there was an elderly gentleman who lived amongst us. He went out in his glutki. And the glutki is this type of chair that people carried him in. They asked Rabbi Shua Levi, is this appropriate? He said, if this person is required by many people, maybe he has to darshan the besmedras, maybe he's a poisek, if he's a very important thing, then it's going to be mutter. The Samchu Rabbi Senu and the Rabbanim also relied on Divrei Achishaki, who was a Talmud Chacham. The Omar, he said, Ano afikte l'Rav Huna mehini l'shili u'mishili lihini. I carried Rav Huna on this chair from the city of Hini to Shili and back. And these two cities were within tchum of each other. But you see, he carried people. I carried Mar Shmuel from the sun to the shade and back into the sun again. So Gemara, there's not a raya that you're allowed to do it without any specific reason. Maybe in those reasons as well, in those cases as well, so maybe that's the only time it's allowed, but it's not allowed in any other instance. Now nowadays, Mushalachim come from Israel to North America. But in those days, there was a Mashalach who went to Israel. He was a Shliach Tzion. He was a Mashalach who went to Israel. Rashi says, Shliach Tzion, Rogel Hoyal al Yerushalayim. He went off into Yerushalayim. Maybe he wasn't in Shul, maybe he was delivering packages. But anyway, he told Reb Chama bar Ada, Kisalkas lahasan. The next time you go to Eretz Yisrael, do me a favor, take a little detour. Akev vizil asul mudatzur. Go through the ladder of Tzur to an area that there's steps that you can get up, and stop off vizil lagabe di Rabbi Yaakov. Go stop off by Rabbi Yaakov and ask him point blank. Kisei ma'atun bey. What do you hold about carrying somebody in a kisei on Yom Tov? Ad azal hasan. By the time he got there, nach nafshid Rabbi Yaakov. They could no longer ask him because Rabbi Yaakov was no longer around. Kisalak, so he continued back up to Eretz Yisrael. Reb Zrika, and he met Reb Zrika in Eretz Yisrael. Amalei, he asked him, Kisei ma'atun bey. What do you think about that? Amalei, hachi Amar Rabami. Rabami said, Uvavat shelo yikaseh. No problem. You're allowed to carry someone on the chair as long as you don't do the action called kasef. My uvavat shelo yikaseh. What does that mean? Amar Puna b'rei Rava ba'alunki. It means alunki. Alunki means if you put your arm on somebody else's shoulder and he puts his hand on your shoulder, so now your two arms form a very solid bridge. And if they put the chair on top of that, that's a way of traveling by chair very far. It's very permanent. That's not allowed. But just to hold a chair with your hands, that would be allowed. Any is that so? For Rab Nachman Sharle Lialta Lemevik Balunki. Rab Nachman let Yalta, I think it was his wife. Yalta was known to be a very tough cookie, and he let her travel with this chair. Shiny Yalta de Beisa. She went not just on the chair, she went in the chair where people were putting their shoulders across. So the extra sturdy, permanent type of way to do it. So how was she allowed to do it? She was afraid. She was afraid of height. She was afraid she would fall. So they allowed for her to make it very secure. And Tosha says she was an important enough person that she was also needed. And they carried her because it was something that she was needed for. They allowed themselves to be carried into the Besmedrash, the Shabbos of Regel, where there were big crowds and they were going to say drushes. We shouldn't be asusa, either because they were afraid they would get crushed in the crowds if they would walk in. Or there are those who say it's because they felt uncomfortable being matriach people when they would walk in, everybody would suddenly stand up. So by carrying them over with the chair, it didn't make anybody stand up, and that's why they did. As I was reading these words, and I was saying that in order to avoid everybody having to stand up, they were brought in by chair through the back entrance. As I was saying those words, Rabbi Lowy walked into the Beis Medrash before Mincha, and we all stood up. The timing could not have been better. Okay, so we'll stop over here. Be'ez Hashem, thank you very much. Tomorrow morning we're going to learn at 7 a.m. and we'll learn at 9:30 as well. And Hoshana Rabbah, I believe the Sikhin is 6:30, so we'll learn at 5:30. And the second learning, I actually want to discuss with the Olam